My name is Lindsay Wegener and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Key Care Queensland. I'm here to talk to you today about my reflections about a roundtable discussion I attended last week where I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Eileen Munro. For those of you who are regular readers of our e-news and our practice blogs, then you'll probably already be familiar with Eileen Munro. In case you aren't, Professor Munro in 2011 concluded a major review of the United Kingdom's child protection system. Soon after the conclusion of Professor Munro's review, PCare initiated our own Munro campaign. That campaign was about engaging our member agencies and other interested parties in looking at some of the key themes of Professor Munro's review and examining what implications that might hold for Queensland and our child protection system here. You may recall a practice blog post that we published in around June that was headed up, "What does the British Bulldog have in common with the Queensland Koala?" In essence, we were asking that question. What do we have in common with the United Kingdom? Putting aside some of the differences in the way our systems are administered, what is it that we might have in common with the United Kingdom? And in what way might Professor Munro's advice also ring true for Queensland? Some other themes that another post that we published included one that was headed, "Is the tail wagging Queensland's child protection system?" Much of what Professor Munro criticised about the United Kingdom was a tendency for procedure to overtake practice, that it was a system that was driven very much by a preoccupation with compliance with procedure rather than good practices driving the child protection system and the kind of principles that underpin good practice. There was a reliance on procedure rather than a confidence in professional capacity to make decisions that would achieve the best outcomes for children and families. So the questions we posed to people in that post were ones about, has Queensland over-regulated our child protection system? Do we, like the United Kingdom, have too many rules, too many procedures, too many performance targets that we need to comply with? And do those kind of rules and targets and systems and procedures truly reflect what is good child protection practice, or have they simply become a substitute for professional expertise and judgment that's now in short supply? Another post that we had published was one that didn't come from the Munro Review, but it came from the minutes of the working party that was charged with the responsibility for implementing the Munro recommendations. And that one was headed, "Warning, remove the scaffolding with care." So the Munro report talked about as the system moved from one that was compliance-driven to one that valued professional expertise. There was a need to approach this with caution and to remove some of the systems that were created to scaffold the system. If we in Queensland similarly move and reform our child protection system along the same lines, what kind of scaffolding will we have to remove with great caution as well? Professor Munro talked about how we go about assessing the quality of services being provided. What she talked about was an inspection system that exists within the United Kingdom, and whether that was one that had become excessively demanding in terms of its bureaucracy. We similarly asked the questions in Queensland, do systems such as the licensing of care services become ones that are excessively bureaucratically demanding rather than ones that focus truly on what do we need to do to achieve good outcomes with children in care? Are they ones that are focused solely on compliance, or do they focus on what really matters? And in Professor Munro's terms, that means whether or not children and families are actually being helped. In a similar vein, we also published a post that was called, "It's all about the sum of the parts, isn't it?" In looking at the United Kingdom system, Professor Munro queried, why is it that only non-government organisations are subject to an inspection system? In Queensland, we could ask similar questions. Why is it that only non-government services are licensed? Why are they the only ones that are participating in evaluations of that kind? What Professor Munro talked about was an effective child protection system is one that requires collaboration. It's the sum of the parts. It's also about the contributions made by youth justice services, by hospitals, by schools. The questions that we asked was, were about what would it look like if the kinds of evaluations that occurred in Queensland didn't simply evaluate non-government services only, but they also evaluated the contributions made by child safety service centres, by youth justice services, by schools, by health services, how do collectively they achieve the kind of outcomes that we are seeking for children and young people. Professor Munro also had certain words of caution to say about excessive use of electronic tools, and we similarly raised those questions for Queensland in a post called Do Tools Rule. We also referred to some research undertaken by Gillingham and Humphreys specifically about Queensland's use of structured decision-making tools, and the kinds of questions that we asked about that were inviting people to consider their experience of the SDM tools and asking questions about, are those tools useful in terms of making decisions and informing practice, or are they ones that drive practice? Are there faults with the design of those tools, or is it simply about the ways in which those tools are being used? Finally, Professor Munro talked about prevention being better than cure. She talked about the need to increase emphasis on prevention and early intervention services and targeted secondary services, in much the similar way that the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children that was endorsed by the Council of Australian Governments in 2009 also similarly talks. The kind of questions we ask about that is, does Queensland have the right understanding about the child protection framework? Are we suitably arranging our kind of services to increase that focus on prevention, early intervention and secondary services? Have we got that balance right? Have we got a system that's being driven by the right kind of considerations to make that kind of system work well? In the new year, PCare intends to reproduce some of the blog posts we've written about the Munro campaign in the form of a discussion paper. That discussion paper will be used as a prelude to workshops that we'll conduct in regions throughout the state. The intention of those workshops is to engage you in further discussion about what we can learn from the United Kingdom's child protection system and what kind of recommendations you have about the future that we should be seeking in Queensland. In the meantime, you're certainly invited to read the posts that are already written and published on our website, and also to sign up to e-news to get further information as we proceed to prepare for these regional workshops. Very pleasingly, Professor Munro seemed happy that we had been producing posts about some of the material contained within her review, and that we've engaged in that course of examining implications for Queensland. She's invited us to send her the links to our website and to produce those copies of the discussion paper for her. Overall, the opportunity to meet with Professor Munro was one that was invaluable. She presented as a person that has very practical advice and enormous insight into the kind of pressures that child protection systems, whether they be in the United Kingdom or Australia, face in today's society. The kind of pressures that come from inquiries and media attention. She also had very good advice about the strategies that could be used to resist the kind of pressure that sometimes is producing solutions that later on become the problem. Over oncoming weeks, PCare will also be inviting other people who had the opportunity to meet with Professor Munro at the roundtable discussion and to hear some of their reflections about that experience, so that they can also let you know about what was important to them in the words that Professor Munro spoke. So keep tuned and stay watching to see some of those further commentaries that we'll be showing you in the future, and also watch out for the discussion paper that will be coming your way early in the new year.